Hello and welcome to MySecurityTV and our Tech and Sec Weekly. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the Executive Editor with MySecurityMedia, and this is our Friday morning episode. If you want to support the channel, check out mysecuritytv.shop and our Cyber War series. And I'm going to bring on Air Vice Marshal John Blackburn AO, retired, and the former Deputy Chief of the Royal Australian Air Force, now with the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. John, pleasure to have you on.
G'day, Chris. Good to talk to you.
And John, this was released this week. You've officially announced and formed the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. And having had a look at the website and the work that you've done with your colleagues, very impressive. You've obviously there's been a lot of planning and thought put into this over many years, I'd imagine. If you could maybe introduce the ASLCG, and then I think when you do that, your background will be highlighted as well.
Yeah, certainly, Chris. Look, over the past couple of years, a whole group of us have been working in a range of think tanks on a whole different issues. And what we were concerned about is that when we talk about climate change and these risks, it's such an emotional discussion out there, often derogatory, and it's so political.
Yeah.
This is too important to leave the discussion of the risks and what we should do just to slang it off at each other. So what we thought is if we got a group together of people, both civil and military background, from defence and the national security areas, emergency services, and said, look, let's have a rational, apolitical discussion about the risks. What are we facing now? What is it that we should be preparing for? Because regardless of whatever we do with emissions, this next 10 or 15 years of climate change is already predetermined according to the scientists. It's the result of what's happened in the last couple of decades. So do we want to wait to react to each climate-induced crisis over the next decade? Or wouldn't it be a good idea to do what militaries do, which they have a thing called preparedness? Let's think about the risk, work out what we need to do. Now, that doesn't mean the emissions discussion is not important. It is critical. But whatever we do in this next decade for emissions is going to affect the following decades, not the real problem that we're going to face on the ground here in Australia and around the world in the next decade.
So there's a few layers in this, and it is a complex issue, and maybe that is why it is government is struggling, it seems. But there's been a number of esteemed leaders, I would say, both from the Australian National University, former defence as well, but political leaders, calling for a national security strategy or a national resilience strategy. And it's not new. I find it frustrating because I see it like, I can't refer to a national security strategy when we just doing a Tech and Sec Weekly. Where do we fit in terms of a national strategy? What do we refer to? And then we've got climate, which is slightly left of field. There's always been that bit of the debate: is it security related, and the like, and is it more emergency services related and others? So, what's your strategy, I suppose, other than the leaders group?
Yes.
And advocate? Do you have a broader strategy or how you're going to roll this out? This isn't just a week one-off announcement. This is an ongoing piece of work.
The group we're doing right now is a particular group we've brought together to look through the lens of climate change and to focus that in a particular narrative and discussion. But for the last decade, after I finished as the Deputy Chief, I was still in the reserve for about the following decade, but I've been involved with a lot of think tanks from the Australia Strategic Policy Institute as a council member. I've been chair of other think tanks, deputy chair of others that dealt with everything from the military issues all the way through to national security. When we formed the Institute for Integrated Economic Research, I'm the chair of that now, we were trying to look much broader, and we said, let's think about our resilience as a nation. How resilient are we? What risks are coming at us and how are we addressing those? What things are we not addressing? Now, climate is one part of that and the whole environment. But on the national resilience front, we said, look, let's look at everything that's going to come at us. And it's interesting, you raised the point of a national security strategy. We had one in 2013, and I, as a reservist, was involved in some of the workshops run by Attorney Generals that helped build it. And Julie Gillard, when she was Prime Minister, tabled it. Not bad. It's not as broad as I think it should be, but it's got a lot of good thoughts in it. But when Tony Abbott came in as Prime Minister, he basically did a burnt earth or scorched earth sort of approach, just threw it out. So today, we still don't have a endorsed national security strategy. We have a defence strategy and we might have a foreign affairs strategy, but it's all stovepipe. So just think of this. You're going to build a house. And so you go and contract an electrician, a plumber, a brickie, a chippy, a whole bunch of people. And you say, we're building the house at this address, off you go. There is no plan for this, but don't worry about it because we've got technology coming along and we haven't set what date we want the people there. Look, just turn up and it'll work out in the end. And you go, well, that's crazy. But that's exactly what we're doing. And in the last couple of months, here's another $1 billion for a sovereign missile capability. And here's $500 million for this. Energy policy is pretty much banal. We're about to lose the last of our refineries in the next year or two. And for example, we will be 100% dependent on fuel from foreign-owned companies, and in some cases government-owned companies, coming to Australia on foreign-owned ships because we don't have any Australian flag ships that can move it. So think about that. That's a huge security risk. We have no plan or policy to deal with it because the government trying to keep the last 4 refineries operating with an offer last year didn't work. But there's no forward plan now. So all these things together really make us vulnerable not only to conventional military threats, but interruptions in how the world works. We saw what COVID did to us with supply chains and health and everything else. Well, what we think is things like climate change. It's not just about warming temperatures and worse weather effects and disease. Imagine if the global supply chains were fundamentally interrupted as the result of climate change. A dust storm in the Suez Canal the other day blocked it for a week when somebody ran aground. But imagine that getting worse.
Yep.
What does that do to our way of life in Australia and our security? And that's why it's not just a weather issue, it's the security of our nation and way of life.
Do you think part of the problem, and look, I agree with you, and I've got 2 points. One is there's still a lot of criticism, and I looked at the Facebook page for the group, and there's you start talking about climate change on Facebook and interesting conversations and interesting comments nonetheless. Do you think part of that problem is if they actually did a strategy, the gaps are pretty glaring and maybe they don't want to face a bit of reality on where Australia actually is?
Yeah.
And is in doing that, is it potentially highlighting some of our own vulnerabilities and weaknesses that maybe we don't want to push out there? So there's that sort of natural resistance to facing a bit of the truth, and then also some of the other sort of criticisms I hear is, oh, hang on, you're either left or right, and you're taking a political view, which And I was going to ask, where would you guys potentially position yourselves on that? You see yourselves as apolitical?
Absolutely.
Or would you admit that you move to left or the right, or you think it's irrelevant?
Well, the fundamental principle we're trying to do on this is we will remain apolitical. This shouldn't be a political issue. It should be a national security issue that affects all Australians and our regional neighbours. Myself, most of my military career, I was voting for Liberal, but after John Howard left and we started to see what was going on with the Rudds and the Abbotts and the others, I said to my Liberal politician colleagues, I can't vote for you anymore. I've still got problems with Labor as well. Both sides of politics are fundamentally broken.
Yeah.
Now, there are individual politicians who are really good, well-intentioned and trying to do it, but the system has become, I think, outdated. So basically, since the time of Rudd, neither side of politics has done any really forward-thinking, brave policy making. If you go back in the economic sense and you look at Hawke, Keating and Howard governments, so both sides of politics did some really brave policy economic decisions. They were hard. The last one's Howard with GST. If they hadn't done that, the chances of us getting through the global financial crisis would have been very, very, very different to what happened. But there were some hard decisions taken. And there's some excellent analysis of this done by Treasury papers that we've based our analysis on. But since that time, it's like everything's internally focused. We had a decade of stabbing each other in the back, and now it's all about the next election. You can't deal with the large, complex challenges that we're facing in the world today by focusing on the election next year, because what it means is a success for the current political system is winning the next election, it's not the best outcome for our country.
Well, it's not the first. Well, sorry to interrupt. It's not the first call. Professor Rory Metcalf, John Blaxland, and Jim Nolan. So I am getting a sense that this is kind of building up the discussions. Everyone's seeing this. Certainly, anyone who looks in this domain is asking for. It doesn't matter what it's called. They're all kind of asking for a very similar thing. Were you? Was this group already been formed? How long has this group been in formation for? As you say, there's think tanks, but is this a sort of just this 2021, or has this been in a formation for a while?
Well, the network that we know each other. I mean, Chris Barrie, previous CDF, has been out really pushing this issue largely by himself, along with a lot of academics for the last decade. But in 2019, we started to say, look, why don't we have more retired defence or national security civilians out there in the public debate? It's quite different. If you look at America, for example, or even parts of the UK, you have these people participating in that debate. And there was a reluctance. There's something about our culture with retired military. Well, I'm not going to go in public. So we said, we've got to do something about this because we want a part of the argument to be placed that is not connected to either side of politics. And so those discussions started in 2019. And as we went through last year to seeing what we do, because setting something like it takes up a fair bit of time, we've got over 30 people in it at the moment. That will grow. Because we're doing this pro bono, it does take a fair bit of time to set these things up. So yeah, it's not an overnight decision.
Well, look, I've put the website. It's aslcg.org to go and have a look. And you mentioned who's behind that. That's the former Chief of the Defence Force, Professor Admiral Chris Barrie. Then you've also got the former, sorry, that was you. Then the former Australian Army Officer, Major Michael Thomas, and the former Defence Department Director of Preparedness and Mobilisation, Adjunct Associate Professor Cheryl Durrant. Now, Cheryl's an interesting one too. She was this is what she was working on in the Department of Defence.
Yes.
So, if anyone knows it, it'll be someone like Cheryl. So what is the strategy? What is the main call from the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group? Okay. What's your time frame, or and your advocacy? We'll see more of you, and maybe where will we see more of you?
Well, you see everything's leading up to the COP conference at the end of the year, and there's a series of events that will be happening right globally. So what we said is we launched this week because we knew the Biden administration was coming out with their statements. So if we step back from just climate and think about resilience writ large, what we're arguing in our overall resilience work is the very most important thing to have up front is an honest discussion about what the risks are, and have that shared discussion, not being pushed by either side of politics. Otherwise, you'll get what happened with the PM the other night when he denigrates the other side of politics. They're all in coffee bars or wine bars and coffee shops, and they're little hobbits or something. That's pointless discussion. It's really juvenile. So what we're saying, number one, let's have an open, honest conversation of what the risks are. It's difficult to have that from within a political party because they'll often spin it. So number one, let's do an info a risk assessment that's transparent. Let's put it on the table what the problem is. And let's learn from the pandemic, by the way, and listen to science, because that's what saved our necks, was when we took the science advice, closed the borders, took control. Now, if we can get that picture together, and we'll be doing a bit of that ourselves using a lot of the research that everybody else has done, but we want to build a community that says, hang on, this is what we think the problem is. Number two, you can't ever fix any of these issues just by yourself. It can't be just the government or the opposition. It's a team effort, and that team effort is going to be a challenge because it's governments, it's industry, it's unions, community groups. It's not just Australia, it's how do we do it with the region. We have to team with New Zealand to help with the Pacific Islands, and it's so obvious. So who's the team we need to do it? And then thirdly, if we're going to build our resilience, of which climate is a key part, you'll know there's no verb associated with the word resilience. The verb is prepare, and it's associated with the military concept of preparedness. Yep. So with the military, you have all the equipment and stuff, but you do so much training and scenario analysis, and you look at all these scenarios and go, how do I prepare that if that scenario happens, I'm ready to do it? So preparedness has readiness and sustainability models. What we want to do is take that model, that idea, and apply it to our society as a whole. Situational awareness, what's the problem? Let's be honest about it. Who has to work together to fix it? Can't do this without industry, that's the key one. Thirdly, what are we actually going to do? Well, we're going to prepare. You can prepare for the next time a major weather event happens, bushfires, whatever. But the next part of it is you have to adapt to the reality of a changing world. So in the next 10 years, we're going to have to change a whole bunch of things. Don't build houses in the middle of a national park with a single road in and out, one example. But we've got to start thinking what else we have to change of our society works as we do energy transitions and other things that will help the climate problem by reducing emissions. And then the other thing we have to do is think about, can we prevent this getting any worse? But that's about a 2-decade decision cycle. And that's where a lot of the work on emissions reduction has to have an effect in that period. So that's the model we want to apply. We will get on and try and prompt this discussion. There's a lot of people trying to do it. We want to take it.
Are you focusing or intending to focus just on the climate challenge? Because we've got sort of the national security challenge at the moment in the Indo-Pacific region as well. So are you focusing just on climate?
With this group, we want to put focus on the climate risk and the security risk, because that can cause military conflicts as well. This group's looking at that. The other group I chair is looking at the bigger resilience issue. So we've been running workshops on that topic since the start of last year. We've had 160 people involved in pro bono workshops. We will have each of the aspects we're looking at done by about the middle of this year. We will then produce an overall report on what we think it is, and that will go public in about September, October this year. So that's the bigger picture. This one is really taking an in-depth focus on this issue because we don't think the political system is able to deal with it at the level it does now. Now, technology is important, but just saying here's $500 million for technology is not going to solve the problem, because it does nothing to help prepare for the inevitable change we'll see in the next decade.
The other one was the role of local and state governments in this. You obviously talk about sort of the maturity of the federal government, but local government and sort of we spoke yesterday. So bringing the resiliency assessments and the risk assessments at a local community level, and having local government do that, and they have been doing that, over the years as well, over recent times, and then pushing that up back to state and local governments and because again, Australia is a large country, and climate will impact differently across the country.
You're absolutely right. Because you think about it, who actually does stuff? Well, the federal government have policies and money. They don't actually do anything. It's the states execute a lot, and then you get down to the councils, they execute a lot. One of the retired military people involved in both of the groups I've talked about, he's actually down there working at the Shoalhaven Council, trying to help and support what they're doing to learn from the bushfires and COVID to improve their resilience. So you're right. The audience for what we're doing is not the politicians, actually. It's everyday Australians. How can we, if it's a family or community or the local council or state government, in federal government, what can we do to improve our resilience, and how can we prepare a bit better? We want to have that conversation first. Now, that will be a lot of innovation is already going out there in the society. Let's support it. Let's talk about it. The thing is, as much innovation as you can generate bottom up, which is really important because you can see the result, you still need to bring together some design across the top of it to sort of have that master plan. That's what the National Security or Resilience Strategy is about. So whilst we're going to try and help that conversation, we want to keep advocating you need a top-down plan, otherwise your house, when you build it, to use the analogy at the start, it's going to be a complete mess.
The workshops you ran, how much does that include? What you had 160 people or thereabouts. What type of roles and backgrounds, diverse and across the country? Any specific? How would you kind of group them, maybe?
So what we did is said, looked at our society, and we said, look at economics, politics, energy, the economy. One of the workshops was first responders and defence. So we had people from emergency services, the rural bushfire, people at the council level, people from defence. And said, look, let's see what you went through with the bushfires, and now you're trying to manage that with the risk of a pandemic, coming back again. How did that work? We've had the Bushfire Royal Commission, which was really good, and they said, there's no excuse for not being prepared. You can't say, oh, this is unexpected. So there's a lot of stuff we're saying, well, rather than wait till the next one is even worse and then we have another Royal Commission, let's take what the Bushfire Royal Commission said, let's take the experience of people on the ground and say, what does that next 10 years look like? What else should we be doing now rather than waiting for it? We had a whole sector on health, and the report on the healthcare of this group came out last year, and we'll be publishing again shortly, because what we see is we're reacting to the pandemic, but we're not preparing adequately for 2022 and 2023, because mutating viruses are not going to be dealt with very well by AstraZeneca. We need to have our own capability in country. So in each of these areas, from a range of experts, we're saying, well, hang on, what should we do differently to address these risks? Aggregating that up in the integrated report is already showing some common things. Our political business model, if I could call it that, the way politics works is everyone gets broken into stovepipes. You have a minister for energy and a minister for the environment, and those two don't talk too much. Then you have a finance and a treasurer. They're all in stovepipes. They don't actually coordinate much. And so where we see problems is because there's no policy that integrates the stovepipes. Everyone's doing their bit on the assumption that if we all do the bit, it'll somehow magically work when it comes together. Doesn't work that way.
Well, my observation of that is also government loves a crisis because that makes them feel like they're doing something and achieving something. They don't like preventing a crisis because they don't get the old adage of security. If security works, nothing happens, and therefore, why do we need security? And same with politicians in a like of, why do we avoid a crisis when we don't get credit for that because nothing happened?
We put $45 billion plus a year into defence. That's preparing for a crisis. Now, if we're prepared...
Well, that was my next question, though, like on that, that's $45 billion, and I'll give Nick Stewart a credit from the Canberra Times on his... that's an expensive way to sandbag, because we're using our defence in exactly what we're talking about, in battling pandemics, battling fires, battling cyclones. And that's really where that money is going, is it not, at the moment? So where's that defence balance go? And what happens if we're at war? Okay. And these things will continue.
So the amount of money of the whole defence budget that goes about is minuscule.
Granted,
yes. When you get a crisis, if you're not at war, everybody's in the team. Get in there and do it.
Very cool.
I think the way they've used defence, carrying suitcases around hotels, is a little bit tacky. It's pointless. And we will argue in that case that these ideas of a civil defence corps or the Green Corps that they used in America years ago, we might be able to help the unemployment bit, not by putting people in uniform, but by creating an area that gives them skill sets to support the first responders, who are the experts doing their bit, or to support the society when you get a crisis. So I think we need a bit of that. But the actual percentage is fairly low. It's just that defence makes a lot of publicity about it. Or sorry, the politicians do. But if we're prepared to do and invest in defence for a big crisis, let's take the same principle and prepare for the crisis of what our society is going to have to deal with in the next few decades. This is not the last pandemic. Climate change and its impacts, according to the scientists, is going to have more and more impacts, not only through the weather, but on how the world works. We've really got to put a bit of priority in doing that, preparing. Because, yet, they don't like a crisis, perhaps, or they like a crisis to respond to it. But when it goes wrong, what they all do is do this. Blame the state, blame someone else, or blame the opposition, or those poor hobbits, or whoever they are, living in the wine bars of the inner cities. I did make a comment the other day that the group we formed to talk climate does not sit in wine bars or cafe bars in inner city sort of vacillating. We have each decades of experience dealing with very complex security problems, and we're serious about changing the conversation, and we're not on either party's side.
Very good. Now, one last one to finish off, we're almost top of the hour, is our role in the region. And you did mention the Pacific Islands, New Zealand, and the general Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific, and how that looks for the regions, because we can't just close the borders like we have with the pandemic and let our neighbours suffer. And really, it is our neighbours that are going to suffer the most before Australia does. So what's our role in the region, and are you addressing that part of it as well?
Yeah, well, as a part of the broader resilience thing, I've had discussions with New Zealand government, defence and industry, and said, look, how do we team together to do this? So, for example, if you need a certain industrial capacity, why think about it just Australia alone? Let's think about it with New Zealand as a team. And if you want some manufacturing areas that might be at, say, a lower cost, let's start to see where we could give some industry into the Pacific Islands. The Kiwis were interested, and I said to them, well, have you had that discussion with our government? And this was a couple of months ago. They said no. So little think tanks are having the discussion. So you've got to take a team. The same thing with New Guinea. What we've talked about make sure they get the vaccines. You have to help your neighbours, and we've got to build a much closer relationship, in my view, with Indonesia, because the predictions the scientists are making about the impact of climate change on food supply, particularly for fisheries, you don't want to see your neighbour having a couple 100 million people with a significant proportion starving. So we've really got to sit down and say, how the hell do we do with it? We have the capacity in this country to produce a lot of food. We still rely on a lot of imports for some of the ingredients. But we've got to think about how do we use that capacity to help stabilise the regional neighbourhood. If we've got that, let's talk to the Indonesians about stuff that they've got that would help us, like fuel. How do we work together to deal with these crises that are coming? There is no point closing the borders and sitting here saying we're okay. It's because we can't function in Australia without the rest of the world.
Yeah, I suppose I do want to keep talking to you, but one was the term sovereignty, how important that is, and then I've got a closing question on so the term sovereignty and resiliency kind of come a little bit hand in hand.
Yeah.
What's your observations or thoughts on the word sovereignty?
With the resilience study we've been doing, last year we appeared before 3 government committees. We were invited to go in there and talk about what we thought. We said, look, what we need is the idea of smart sovereignty. We'll never produce everything we need. So where are those areas that it makes sense to have a manufacturing capability in Australia, but more importantly, the right skill sets and experience in the people, the right training, the right research. So there are certain areas you need a capacity that would, in a crisis, allow us to have sufficient supply to allow society just to keep functioning. So that's not 100% of our needs. It might be 30 or 40%. So let's work that out. Now, for critical areas, you've got to make sure that the supply chains where you don't manufacture something are trusted. And that means they have to be transparent. In other words, you have to understand what the supply chain is, and you've got to be able to verify it.
Yeah.
So in medicines, I would say that we need a certain capacity to manufacture, that a resilient one means you don't produce a vaccine in one factory, one location with one production line. That's not resilient. You've got to have a couple of different production areas in case one burns down or something, and different types. So you work that out and say, oh, hang on, right now we import 90% of our medicines. We want some capacity. Of those critical medicines that we import, can we trust the supply chain? And right now, you cannot find anywhere in public a clear description of where all our drugs come from and the chain they go through. The pharmaceutical industry representatives here in Australia say, well, that's intellectual property, we won't tell you. You can find it if you go into New Zealand and see what they're doing. And the Americans have identified that as a huge resiliency risks, and they're doing something about it. In Australia, we just turn a blind eye to it. So there's areas, smart sovereignty and trusted supply chains. Now, other supply chains, like whether a T-shirt turns up or a pair of thongs, I don't really care about that. But stuff that makes our society keep functioning is what we've got to identify.
I like that, smart sovereignty, and I've been kind of resisting the term sovereignty overall. It gets thrown around way too often. Yeah. But I'll be coming back. Is it smart sovereignty? It's a good counter question. Yeah. And the last one, John, I just turned 50 yesterday. And,
you're a young pup.
Yeah, well, I can get the vaccine now. How confident are you moving forward and say, here we are, 2021, how confident are you that we're in a good place in 2050 moving forward?
We have the intelligent people, experienced people, and we have all the ingredients to deal with the challenges we're faced with if we're prepared to team and work in a different way. I have confidence in the Australian people. I've seen in industry, because I've dealt from large companies right down to SMEs and little startups, I've seen a lot of innovation and ingenuity. What's fundamentally lacking in this country is political leadership. I've seen a bit at the state level, but our problem with our federation structure is that every state does its own thing, and you've got a federal government level which, since the time, in my view, of the Rudd era, has floated around with self-focus. Unless we as a group of Australians say to the federal government, enough's enough, get your act together, because it's too serious to watch you lot play games. As I said, this week we've still got the PM playing games with the Business Council and insulting people. So as Australians, we need to say, we're voting you into position to help lead. Start leading. Is my confidence that will change? Not very high, I've got to be honest with you. I've got more confidence in trying to get community groups, state governments, industries, not all of them, talking together about enough's enough. So are we smart enough to do it? Yeah, I'm optimistic about that. Am I optimistic about the political level? In some individual politicians and the younger generation, yes. In the older generation, in the current government, no.
Okay, well, look, it's kind of pretty consistent where I am as well, to be honest. And I think a lot of other people are in. My job is really about observing the market and the commentary, other commentators there, and much is being said. So look, I think kudos to cracking on with it and contributing as a group under the guise of the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. And no, I do appreciate your time and recognition. You can go to the aslcg.org. They're also on Facebook. Welcome to check that out and get involved. And maybe that is a good way to finish off. John, what is your call to action and for people to get involved or support or just watch out for more?
No, let's start a conversation. When you see something, start talking to your neighbours, your friends, your colleagues, and say, let's get a proper, realistic risk assessment done and require that of the government. Let's talk about what the risk is, and let's have an agreed picture where science agrees and we can have I guess, an idea of what the problem is that we're trying to address rather than hiding it. So let's have that conversation in public. Go and talk to your local member and ask them, why don't we have a proper risk assessment that's published? What's wrong? We haven't had one for a decade or so. So let's put that issue to your local member, because there's one thing I've found politicians do react to: pressure within their electorate.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, good call to action. Thank you so much. That's Air Vice Marshal, or former Air Vice Marshal John Blackburn, AO, retired, former Deputy Chief of the Royal Australian Air Force with the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group. John, I'll let you enjoy your day. Thank you very much for your time. Pleasure talking to you, and hopefully we'll talk to you again as well.
You're welcome, Chris. Good to talk to you.
All the best. See you, John. Okay, very good, and a good segue. And we'll link this interview with our Indo-Pacific series, our interviews with John Blaxland and the like as well. And again, I think we can build a series of like-minded individuals calling for much the same thing on national resilience. The report of the day is the Netscout Threat Intelligence Report. They've just crossed over 10 million attacks for the second half of 2020. That's a 20% increase year over year and a 22% increase in the last 6 months of 2020. So these are DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, and the 2020 stats are max size 1.12 terabytes, max throughput 581 Mbps. Let me check on Mbps, and then we've got 750 attacks. Large regional attack frequency is the MEA, so Europe, Middle East and Africa. And then the last one there, average global attack duration 39.83 minutes. So there you go. It's the latest report on the MySecurity Marketplace. Welcome to check that out. That's the Netscout Threat Intelligence Report.